We're going to be here all day. No, thank you. I'm so pleased to be here, and this whole thing started out when Jean-Michel and I were invited to be on a panel to discuss what Canadian business schools could do to help with this 4X growth challenge that Jean-Michel has just been talking about. And we were sort of the two lone voices in the room trying to shake it up. And so I immediately went to him afterwards. I said, here's my card. And he says, what, you still have cards? Like, 21st century, let me just write your email in my phone. We have been having a conversation ever since about how to think differently about this growth challenge that we're talking about. And if you want to grow 4X, then you have to find all the talent. And if you want to find all the talent, you're going to have to think about all the people who are not included in our typical talent pool. So I'm going to talk about gender equality as an innovation challenge. Part of the reason, part of my thinking, my whole career, I've been a researcher on innovation. And then a couple years ago, probably during the American election, as Jean-Michel mentioned, I am an American immigrant to Canada. I've been here 9 years. I saw just how far we haven't come. Like, I've been working for more than 30 years, and everyone told me my generation was the generation where it was all just we were going to go through the pipeline and everything was going to be fantastic. And I woke up one day and said it wasn't, so I founded this Institute for Gender and the Economy a couple of years ago to basically try to have a different kind of conversation about inclusion, because I think we've been having sort of the same conversation and we haven't gotten very far. So the question is, how can we take our principles of innovation, you all are experts in that, and think differently about how we are going to build a more inclusive model for innovation in Canada? It actually drives me crazy when we have these conversations about the Canadian superclusters and all this stuff, and everyone says we want to be just like Silicon Valley. And I'm like, we for sure do not want to be just like Silicon Valley. Like, what about Silicon Valley? I mean, I'm a Californian, so like, I'm a Californian, so it's a little bit heresy for me to say that, but Silicon Valley works for some people and has produced some really cool stuff, but it also doesn't work for a lot of people. And I think some of the problems that some of the technologies are facing, if we look at some of the things that are happening with certain companies on privacy and things like that, come in part because that community has not been inclusive. And so I'm on a project, Jean-Michel's on a project, hopefully all of you are on a project to completely upend what we think about in terms of the superclusters and scaling technology and innovation in Canada, and try to come up with the Canadian model that's going to be bigger, better, and more friggin' awesome, to quote my friend Jean-Michel. Okay, so you know, there's been all this conversation, business case for diversity, everyone's convinced of it, blah, blah, blah. Yes, we all talk about it, everyone seems to say that it makes sense, and you know, so there's a million different conversations you could have about the business case, but the challenge is that despite having been making this business case for a number of years, we still really haven't made that much progress. Lots, not just in Canada, but around the world. And let me just give you an example of, in Canada, there's been a ton of attention to women on boards, as one example. And I'm going to use this as a way to talk about some of the challenges in your own organizations that are not necessarily board related. But you know, now for 3 years, the Ontario Securities Commission has had a rule that companies had to have diversity on their boards, or they had to explain why not. And after 3 years, we see that still only 12%, almost 13% of board seats are held by women. And in fact, 46% of companies still have no women on their boards at all. And when you ask them, you know, do you have a diversity policy? Only about a third even do. And when you ask them if they have a target, only about 11% do, right? So everyone says the business case is so important, and yet somehow no one is putting, usually when you have a business case and you want to do something, you put targets, you set ambitious goals, you have action plans, and it turns out most companies don't have action plans and most companies don't have targets and goals. And why? The interesting thing here is why, because they have to do the explain part. And the explanations are things like, we don't want to compromise the principles of meritocracy. We don't want to get into a situation where we can't select the best candidate. The pipeline, there's not enough women available. Where are those women? There was a great article or several articles covering the UK, because the UK now also has these board rules. And the arguments that the boards were making were things like, I don't know, are women interested? Not sure. So it's like there's this set of beliefs and ideas that I think are really getting in the way of thinking creatively about this challenge. Sorry, some of the numbers on my slides didn't come out, so next time I will PDF. I don't know what happened to the numbers, but just to give you a sense why I think this is going on is because, and I'm going to use gender, but you could think about this in terms of other dimensions of diversity as well. But for those of you, many of you have taken an implicit bias test or done it? Yeah, so few of you, yeah, you know. So basically when you take this test, what happens is you learn to hate yourself, right? Because you take it and you're like, oh my God, I'm sexist. Or you take the one about LGBTQ community, you're like, oh, I'm homophobic. Or you take the one on race, you're like, oh, I'm racist. You know, like, so that's what these tests basically do. And it's good to be aware of the fact that implicitly, even if we don't intend to be that way, we have some of these implicit, unconscious kind of reactions. It's a primary frame. And by unconscious bias, what we mean is it kicks in way before any other thought processes kick in. So when we meet someone, the gender of the person actually shapes how we even think about interacting with them. Do we touch them? How far away do we stand? What do we do? All of those things. And it's that primary frame, that ability to assess that helps you immediately know how to act in the world. And if you don't, our brains work that way. We categorize. So it's a natural thing that brains do. But the problem is that this particular one basically says that in general, in the business world, we associate men with career and men with technology. There's a STEM one too. You can take the STEM one. If you haven't taken it, go to Implicit at Harvard. You'll find like 16 tests you can take to hate yourself in 16 different ways. But what it basically says is we basically think that men are associated with career and professional technology and women are associated with home and humanities and literature, right? Like that's basically what we think implicitly, not explicitly. And the problem with that is not that we necessarily just think that in and of itself, but that it actually is affecting all sorts of important business decisions where we are devaluing women's contributions. And I'll give you just 3 quick examples, you know, that basically say that excuse about meritocracy that boards are making or other people are making is really not a great excuse. So if you look at the first set of bars on the left, you know, when you give people equal resumes, all the skills are the same. The only thing that's different about the resume is one's named Jennifer and one's named John for a lab tech role, you know, and then you ask people to rate how hireable is that person. John is more hireable than Jennifer. Okay, then you might think, okay, that's just individual people. You might think, well, Jennifer is gonna go on mat leave at some time in the next 10 years, and so we're really worried about that already. So we go to pitching startups, and a lot of people have said in the startup space, well, the problem is women aren't proposing very interesting businesses, so that's why you know, only 2% of VC money is going to women-led businesses. So some of my friends decided to do an experiment where they actually created a business opportunity, a PowerPoint, and a script. It was identical, and investors looked at it, and the only difference was that sometimes the script was narrated by a woman, and sometimes it was narrated by a man. And then they asked the investors, how investable was this opportunity? And basically, the one narrated by a male voice was twice as investable as the one narrated by a female voice. Same business, same financials, same technology risks, everything. The only difference was in people's brains, they heard the female voice and they devalued the opportunity. Or they heard the male voice and they overvalued. You can take your pick on that. Now, okay, those are humans. Maybe we have a problem interacting with humans. So another researchers did this study where they had people work on computers and, you know, did tasks, and everyone rated that the computers did the task exactly the same, all that kind of stuff. And then they were told, some people were told their computer's name was Julie, and some people were told their computer's name was James, and then they were asked how much the computer was worth. And it turns out James is just worth more than Julie for whatever reason. So, tragic, I know. You see these studies and you're like, really? But this is where the implicit bias plays out. Why it matters is because we are devaluing, we are undervaluing, we are assigning different financial opportunities, we're assigning different job opportunities to men than to women simply because of gender, and not to do all of these studies completely control for underlying quality. So this is not a quality story in any way. And when you actually look at the research, there are some ways that men and women are different. Like on average in Canada, women are 5'4", and on average in Canada, men are 5'9". But by the way, there's a distribution. Not all women are 5'4". And so you can see there are some real differences between men and women. But when it comes to risk taking, there are almost no differences at all. Yet we all think, because of our implicit bias, that women are more risk averse than men, all this kind of stuff. Well, why do we think that? We think that because, in fact, we put them in situations like the ones I just showed you before, where it's actually so much riskier for a woman to pitch a business because it's so much less likely that she's going to get funded. It's so much riskier for her to put in for a job because it's so much less likely that she's going to get hired. And then we say women are risk averse. And I'm like, wait a minute, the system just produced that risk aversion. Women intrinsically are not more risk averse than men on average in experimental studies. Yes, there's a distribution, but there's a distribution around men too. So there's not any fundamental difference between men and women, but there's a lot of believed differences. And that's why we see things like Silicon Valley being so awful for women, or I love this picture that just came out. We have only 2 more women CEOs of Fortune 500 companies than men named John. So anybody named John here, you're good to go. You are good to go for CEO. And why is that? People say, oh, well, there isn't a pipeline. What's going on? Why aren't there, that's why we can't hire more women into these CEO roles. But I thought really hard about this pipeline problem, and some friends of mine down in Boston at Northeastern University and Boston University did this really interesting study that's still in a working paper form, where they looked at students at university in engineering and taking internships. And what they were able to do was look at students who took internships because they were randomly assigned to take an internship earlier in their career or later in their career, because they just couldn't have students take all their internships at the same time. And what they found was if students took their internships later in their career, they don't switch majors or do anything like that because they're about to finish. It's quite far into their career. But if they took their internships earlier in their academic career, women were much more likely to switch out of the engineering major or to change the courses that they took and move in a different direction. Why? Because their experiences in the jobs were not good. They didn't feel like they belonged. They were not welcomed. It was a hostile environment. And so when people say, oh, there's a pipeline problem, I'm like, you produced it. You produced that pipeline problem if you create an environment where people don't feel welcome or don't feel like they belong. And that's what this research is showing, is that in fact women are switching away from the engineering major because of the work experience that they have. And then people want to blame universities, but I'm like, okay, I'm a university professor, I take some blame, but I also want to have you do a little navel gazing yourselves about the pipeline problem. Okay. This idea of meritocracy that I talked about, that becomes this reason, this excuse not to include women, oh, well, they just weren't more qualified. Actually, when you understand that this meritocracy is colored by our biases that we have, what you see, and I've done a whole bunch of research and interviews about this, is that, for example, in Silicon Valley, people saying to me things like, meritocracies are noble and worthy goals, but they're myths. The only thing that meritocracy serves in Silicon Valley is as a great validation if you've made it. It just justifies your success. You are just that much smarter than anyone else. So if you're a white man in leadership, you want to believe it's a meritocracy because you're a leader, and otherwise, what does that say about your role? Similarly, in Wall Street, a friend of mine said the feeling that they did an analysis of a particular firm, very high profile firm on Wall Street, said the feeling that this was a meritocracy was much more likely to be held by those in the majority, the white male heterosexual group. The non-majority members were much more likely to say there were hidden rules for success and it was harder to get the right opportunities. So in other words, we use this notion of meritocracy to justify the existing system that we have, but in fact what it is doing is excluding people, not really truly about meritocracy, because we can see how the bias plays out. We can see how the system is not meritocratic, how women's contributions are undervalued. And so you probably know about James Damore, our friend from Google, who wrote that internal memo that got him fired. And what he basically argued was, and the New York Times thought it was a good idea to put an article about this on, was that has the push for gender equality gone too far? And what we're seeing is this reaction, that this interest in diversity, because we care about growth, because we care about talent, because how you get to 4X, you're not going to get to 4X only hiring white men. Like, there's just not enough people to do that. And by the way, you're not going to have the most talent. You really need everyone out there, new Canadians, women, people of color, Aboriginal people. You need all of those people represented, and for one, just to get the talent, but two, because you're going to make better products. And And I think the reason that we get stories like James Damore's stories, this pushback, this anger at efforts to make improvements, is in part because, and this is a quote that I can't figure out who originally said, so I'm just going to say the internet, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. That means if you've always had the tailwinds, and other people have always had the headwinds, and then you just take away your tailwind and you take away the headwind of the other people, you are going to feel like you're getting the raw deal. And I talked to someone before this session about, this idea that people are afraid of reverse discrimination. Well, basically, leveling the playing field is going to feel like reverse discrimination to a lot of people who've been in positions of privilege. And it won't be reverse discrimination because all we're doing is we're saying those bar charts that I showed you, we're going to just level out those bar charts. So when it's equal quality, you get equal opportunity. And that's not happening now because of our biases. And so what we end up seeing is some of this kind of reaction, which is in some ways an excuse to not make progress. And the reason I think this is really important to think about is because, as you've probably heard like a million times, diverse teams make, more innovation and stuff like that. And a lot of the conversation has been around, well, we need the diversity because it's diversity of thought. It brings different perspectives. And that's for sure important. But in fact, the research is suggesting that it's not even that we bring diversity of perspectives when we have different kinds of people in the room, but that people make us, different people that we're not so familiar with, that we're not like, haha, buddy, buddy, make us a little bit uncomfortable, and that discomfort is part of what makes us more innovative because we have to state our assumptions more clearly, we listen more carefully to other people because we're not sure if we really understood their point of view, and it is that process that makes us more innovative, not just that people have different ideas. So if you do the diversity right and you include people, that is what's going to actually generate the innovation. And that's why this diversity of thought thing, there was someone at Google who also said I could have a room full of 12 white men and have diversity. And I'm like, no, pretty much not. But they're saying, well, because one's an engineer and one's a marketer and one's a computer science, blah, blah, blah. The diversity of thought thing I think is really important, but can also be yet one more excuse to justify the existing system if we're not careful about how we mobilize that. And really the most important thing about diversity is that we change our process. We become more innovative because we're not in groupthink, we're making our assumptions clear, we're working hard together to hear each other's points of view. And that's hard work, and what the research suggests is that that hard work is something like any muscle that, you go to the gym. If you go to the gym, I now have to have a trainer or I just won't go. Forces you to do it, but then you do it and you work hard, you build that muscle. And it's the same thing with inclusion and being, and diversity in organizations. It's a muscle that you build, you have to practice, you have to train, and it's not going to also necessarily be super easy. But it is going to make you more innovative. So as I said, I have spent my whole career doing research on innovation, and I've been trying to think about why we're so stuck in the existing conversation, why we haven't moved the needle, and I think in part because we end up having these same old boring conversations about diversity rather than thinking about how is diversity basically essential to innovation and how is innovation essential to diversity. So I wrote this piece that at the time I called Because It's 2017, Gender Equality is an Innovation Challenge. It was based on Justin Trudeau's 2016 statement when he was asked about his cabinet being 50% female, and he said, well, 2015, he said, because it's 2015, then now I have to cross it out and put 2018. I want to stop crossing this out. I want to retire one day, so we need to make progress. Like, we can't keep just crossing it out and saying, oh yeah, we're going to get to that sometime in the future, because that's what they were saying in 1986 when I started working. And so, like, the future is now. Like, for me, 86, 2018, when I was just coming out of university, 2018 felt like basically sci-fi. Like, it was so far away. But here we are in sci-fi, and we haven't made the progress. So we need to think differently and challenge ourselves. All the innovation skills that you have, what if you applied those? All the excitement that you applied to innovation, what if you applied it to creating more inclusive organizations? I think we'd have a great opportunity. So I'll just close with a few different examples, and then I want to open it up for Q&A. So I kind of talked fast because I wanted to to have a conversation with you. There's lots of ways that you can innovate. You know, for example, there's all sorts of companies launching financial products that invest in companies with female leadership or good practices. You know, so there's, you know, that's one way, creating new metrics that allow you to value things in a different way. And then there's all sorts of interesting, innovative companies that are launching new processes and technologies. Ellevest, which is a company that basically thinks that they can use the new financial technologies to kind of disrupt how women invest and like basically change the way that women access financial markets. Naya, which is a company that's innovating in breast pumping. A lot of people go back to work. They still want to, you know, give their baby breast milk. If you've ever seen a breast pump, you will know it's like basically looks like you're walking into some weird time machine, and it's not, doesn't look like an iPad or something like, you know, cool. So Naya's basically trying to make like the iPad of breast pumps, so that's cool. Hologic, another company that's innovating in mammogram technology, because again, another technology for sure designed by men. Not the most comfortable technology in the world, and they're really innovating in that to see if they can do better breast cancer diagnosis. Textio is a company you've probably heard of that's using AI to identify gender bias in job ads to help you neutralize your job ads. Callisto is a company in the US, and we have a sister company in Canada that's using new technologies to improve reporting on sexual harassment. So there's lots and lots of different examples of ways that if you just thought innovatively, you could create great opportunities in the marketplace, and also if you're more inclusive in your organization, you're going to have a better insight into those opportunities. So with that, I will stop because, I mean, even before in the coffee, I was having all sorts of chats with people, so I assume there's some things that you want to talk about. Maybe it's hard in this huge of a room with so many people, but hopefully, Jean-Michel, we're creating the safe space for the day. So